Alright, starting a new series here. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about some music theory stuff and maybe do even a little bit of writing exercises. If you haven't been through the other ones, videos, which talk about rhythm and pitch and basic intervals and all of that, I encourage you to go back and check those out because none of this is really going to make any sense without that basic music theory understanding. Also, of course, to give a shout out here to the folks who make music and several of the books that we'll be using, like the Casca and Payne Tonal Harmony, that will be my reference materials for this. So, not creating information totally from scratch. I want to make sure I give credit where credit is due. Alright, so let's talk about some chords. We've talked about intervals already. The space in between notes. So chords are most basic version of a chord is a triadic chord. Okay? And a chord that's composed of 3 notes stacked in thirds. So every space to space to space, or line to line to line. Okay? It's basically skipping every other note. Now the bottom note is called the root. Okay? And then the second note up, the middle note, is called the third. So we have root, and we have third. And it's because it's a third away from the root. So we have 1, so in this case F, F, G, A. It's the third note away from the root. And then the top one is called the fifth. Once again, because we're always measuring everything we do when it comes to thinking horizontal or vertically in music. Everything we do goes from the bottom up, at least for now. So we have our root, our third, because it's a third up from the root, and our fifth, because it's a fifth up from the root. Okay? This is called a root position triad, because the root is on the bottom. Now, we'll talk about inversions here in a moment, but let's first make sure that we get the basic idea of it correct. Okay, so root position triad. If we had a G here, we would skip up to the next line. If you look down where the mouse is pointing, at number 1. From G, our third would be a B, G, A, B. That's the third note of that scale if you're thinking about it in terms of scales. G to B, and then G to D would be our fifth. So each time there's the third in between. So for instance, if you were to jump back up to the example and start on the A to C is a type of third. Now, if you were paying attention to the previous video, you would be able to figure out by counting the half steps, or if you know your major scales, whether it's a major third or a minor third. And I'm just going to go ahead and throw it out there. It's a minor third because you have A to A sharp, that's a half step. Then A sharp to B, it's another half step, so now we got 2. Then B to C, that's a third half step. Okay? Minor thirds, 3 half steps. So what we've got here are thirds stacked on top of each other. So let's put this into practice for a moment. If I'm just going to be thinking chords, let's start with C, because that will be the easiest. C. If I stack a third above it, a third above that, which is a fifth above the root being the bottom note, and listen to it, it's a very pleasing consonant, non-clashy sound. If I started in a different place, bass clef, and I stuck with C, it would still end up being that way. Now the important thing to remember is that these chords can come in different flavors depending on what the spaces are in between the intervals. So if we're going to stick with major chords for a moment, which I think we should, if we start on F, what's the next note that would have come up? Good, A, and then after that the fifth would be C. And even though the chords are the same stacking, because they have a different root, they're going to sound slightly different. Let's go ahead and throw, so we have both octaves of it. Okay, so our F chord, right here, FAC, is going to have just a different inherent characteristics based on its root than the C chord is going to. Now both of those are major chords. If I were to start on, let's say, for instance, an A, and I go to a C, we just talked about how this would be a minor third because of the number of half steps in between, and then up to the fifth of an E. This is going to have a different characteristic. It's going to sound different than our major chords did. And to get the octave in there. So it's got that darker sound that we talked about when we talked about the difference between major and minor thirds. The minor third is going to sound sadder to most people. If I were, however, to take this third and raise it, I'd be back to major chords. And that whole time I've stuck with the major chords. Now, it's so important to understand your major scales for some of the way chords work to make sense. Now, the first part of this, of course, is simple in the fact that the chords are stackings of thirds. But if you know your scales, and you know, for instance, you have whole step, so you have a whole step in first, between the first two intervals, a whole step between the second two intervals, then a half step, C sharp to D gives you the half, then whole step, then another whole step, and E to F has to have that raised note to keep it a whole step, and then another whole step, which means we have to raise G again, and then finish out in A. So that gives us our major scale. Remember from the major scale video that our pattern for major scales is whole step, half step, whole step, half step. This concept gives us a lot of important things when it comes to our music. And specifically, this gives us the idea of a key signature. So every scale has a certain combination of whole steps and half steps, of sharps and flats to make the pattern work. So we know that that pattern, once again, whole, half, whole, half, has to happen. And you get to start on your note. It doesn't matter what note it is. So let's say I want to start on, well, let's pick something that will end up being flatter. Let's say I start on an E flat. Okay? E flat to F is a whole step. F to G is a whole step. Then we have to have a half step, which means we lower the A flat. We have to have a whole step. A flat to B would be a step and a half, so we have to lower the B. Then B flat to C, C to D, and of course we always finish up on the same note we started with. Okay, then that gives us our major scale. Now, to simplify a little bit in our notation, there are these things called key signatures. And key signatures are simply taking the flats and sharps that we had here that go along with the scale and putting them at the front of the line of music. So we just did our E flat scale, which has E flat, A flat, and B flat in it. Or, if you're thinking about it in the music theory terms, B flat, E flat, and A flat. And I'll explain why in a later video. But for right now, just understand there's an order of flats and an order of sharps that are always the same. So all the sharps will always go in the same order, all the flats will always go in the same order. And there's a reason for that. But just for now, accept that they're going to be flats that get printed in the music. So right now, I've now made this staff piece of paper in E flat. Okay? Because I have the notes B flat, E flat, and A flat, B flat, E flat, and A flat marked in here that tells me as a shorthand that every time I see those notes, they're going to be flat. So that's not an E, even though there's no flat symbol next to it. It's an E flat because the key signature tells us all E's are flat. So as I write this out, and hopefully fidelity will play nice, but they should sound the same. Okay? Same exact thing. This is writing it with accidentals, the little symbols in front of the note that tell us that they're flat. This is writing with the key signature. And a key signature is shorthand. So I encourage you to do a Google search or find a resource somewhere that tells you the major scales and what's the flats and sharps in them. Because the quicker you get that in your brain and the more you understand major scales, the more everything else is going to make sense that we do. So let's go ahead and get rid of the key signature for right now, which is going to make this all kinds of wonky. Boom. And computer program automatically moved it to C, because C is the major scale that has no flats and sharps in it. And let's talk, using C, a little bit about how chords work. Okay? Based on our major scale, we end up with different chords in different places. Now, that may sound a little bit confusing, but let me explain a little bit. Okay? Every note in the major scale is going to be a root. So what we have here is a major scale, our C scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And let's go ahead and put it in the bass clef, just so that we can have both octaves when we work. G, A, B, C. Remember, of course, that the bass clef notes are going to have different assignments for the lines and spaces. So what we have here is our basic major scale. When we build chords off of it, they automatically have specific characteristics because of the key signature, because of the space in between the intervals, because of the way the sharps and flats are arranged. So, when I put a triad here, C to E, that's a third. E to G, that's a third. C to G is a fifth. That makes our triad, our chord. And we're only going to be dealing in root position chords and chords that are stacked like this in terms of thirds in this video. Okay? That is a major chord. But if I go here and do the same thing, D to F and F to A, okay, does that sound like a major chord? Listen. Well, let's get the octaves in. So let's see. Listen to these and see if they sound the same. And hopefully you can tell a slight difference there. And the difference is in this third. The third of the chord, in this case F, gives us an idea of the characteristic of the chord. Now, it's not the only thing. There are other things that can happen, and we'll talk about them here just real briefly. But the biggest difference between chords is the third. If the space between the root and the third, in this case the D and the F, is a major third, then the chord will be some kind of a major chord. If the space between the root and the third is a minor third, then the chord will be some kind of minor or minor major or some derivative of a minor sound. So what we have here is we have a major chord, C, E, G. Okay? Because if we did a C scale and we went straight up it, those would be the notes we have. Okay? If, however, we did a D scale and went straight up it, we'd have to change that third to a sharp to make it fit naturally in a D scale. Or another way to think about this, once again, is what about the half steps in between those notes? So D to D sharp, that's a half step. D sharp to E, that's a half step. Now we're up to 2. E to F is a half step. 3 half steps. 3 half steps are a minor third. That's the space. You have to have 4 half steps to get a major third. So 3 half steps for a minor third. So with that in mind, what we have here is we have E, G, and B. So you tell me, is that a major chord or a minor chord? Is the space from the E to G 4 half steps or only 3? And if you need to refer to your keyboard cheat sheet from way back when we talked about sharps and flats and intervals several videos ago, please feel free to do so. Or just simply Google. Google Images has some great resources for sharps and flats in a keyboard. So E to F, half step. F to F sharp, half step. F sharp to G, half step. So E to G is only 3 half steps, which makes it a minor chord. F, A, and C. What about this one? Major chord or minor chord? Well, hopefully you're able to just go F to F sharp to G, G to G sharp to A, boom, 4 half steps, so that's a major chord. Now, that's the intellectual way to think about this. But let me go ahead and fill out this 5th chord and 6th chord real quick. And let's listen to these and see if we can hear a difference. We'll slow it down just a little bit. Okay? Now, it may be kind of hard to hear that because what you hear is the scale. I can clearly hear the difference between the chords, but I understand if it's a bit more challenging. So, let's do it like this. I'm going to write a couple of more chords before we deal with these last two. I'm going to write a couple of more chords in here. So let's start with our root chord. Whoops. This is also called the tonic chord. And it's called that because it's based on the first note of the scale of the key we're in. So this section we're working on is based on the key of C, because it's our C scale. And this is a chord where the root note is C, thus making it tonic. Also known in music notation land, or music theory land, as the 1 chord. Okay, the starting chord of the scale and of the key. So we have the 1 chord here. And let's put a 3 chord. So what would a 3 chord start on? Well, hopefully you said E, because E is the 3rd note of the C scale. And let's listen to these 2 chords back to back. Can you hear the darkness there? Now you may be saying to yourself, well, that's because the bass clef is so much lower. Okay, fine. Let's put the bass clef back up in the same place and see if you can hear the darkness in the in-between. Dum, dum. It feels like it almost descends. It doesn't actually. As you can see, the notes are going up. All of the notes are going up. But the sound is a darker sound. And that's really the difference between the major and minor chords. So back to our scales. We have here C chord, tonic chord, 1 chord. It's major. We have D chord, 2 chord. I'm not going to worry about all of the names because each one of these chords in a scale has a name. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them in this. I'm only going to mention 2 in this video because they're the only 2 you need to know for now. But so we have our 2 chord, which is minor. We already talked about why. Our 3 chord, it's minor. Our 4 chord, it's major. Our 5 chord, this one is known as the dominant chord. It is major. So G to G sharp to A to A sharp to B. That's 4 half steps between the root and the 3rd, the G and the B, G and the B. And so that means that this chord is a major chord. Now the dominant chord is very, very important because so much of music, and it has to do with the way things vibrate, so I'm not going to get, it can get awfully technical if you let it. But the dominant chord, the 5th, the chord that's based on the 5th of the scale, so if we're thinking about our scale, C, D, so C's 1, D's 2, E's 3, F is 4, G is 5. The chord that's based on the dominant, the 5th note, in whatever key you're talking about, is a very important scale. You might even recognize the sound. And let me go ahead and finish it off with a 1 chord so that it resolves, and so that I, whoops. So that I don't go crazy. That might sound familiar. That is the most basic chord progression and way that music can function. So it doesn't get any really much simpler than that. There are other chords you can do, but that right there is the structure of most Western music. 1 chord, 5 chord, 1 chord. Okay? Or tonic, dominant, tonic. Now, this whole chordal structure comes from these scales, and I left out these last couple. So let's just really quick go over that. So we have our G chord, our dominant, which is 5, our A chord, which is 6, it is minor. And by the way, in a major key, these things are always true. So 2 is always minor, 4 is always major. Okay? These things are always true in a major scale, or a major key rather. So tonic, major, 2, minor, 3, minor, 4, major, 5, major, 6, minor. Okay? 7 is kind of a special case. Let's move this down a little bit. Okay, the 7th chord is a gross sounding chord. Because if you count the half steps in between, you'll notice that it's a bit more squished down than the other chords were. So G to G sharp, that's a half step. G sharp to A is a half step. A to B is a half step. That's 3 half steps, minor third. But let's keep going. B to C is a half step. C to C sharp is a half step. C sharp to D is a half step. That's another minor third. So the 7th chord has 2 minor thirds stacked on top of it, whereas all the rest of them have only 1 minor third. So D to F is a minor third. F to A is a major third. Okay? So the space in between the notes affects the sound. And if you listen to this 7th chord, it's going to sound a bit funky. Can you hear how clashy it sounds? How tense? How uncomfortable it sounds? And we'll go ahead and let it resolve this time to the tonic. Okay? That clashing is because the notes are more squished together. When notes are squished together in certain ways, they create that more clashy sound. We call that dissonance. So a consonance is a happy space. An octave, or a third, or a fifth. A fifth is a really good one. Let's just get rid of that third real quick and hear some fifth action. So those are just no thirds, just roots and fifths. Those are very consonant sounds. They sound pleasant to the ear. Then the 2 minor thirds stacked on the top of each other sound a little bit more rough. Okay? Just as a quick little preview for next time video, we have down here probably one of the most popular chord progressions in modern music. I know a lot of musicians who call this the 4-chord song progression. And you may not recognize it that high, so let's take it down an octave. But if you've listened to pretty much anything on the radio ever, you've heard at least one song that's built around those 4 chords just repeated over and over again. Now, when it comes to understanding the way music is put together, it's important to understand these things, but this isn't all there is to it. There's, of course, melody and how the two interact. And what do you do with chords that are not with the root and the bottom, like right here, or right here? And those are things, those inversions are something we'll talk about in the next video. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I started going quite a bit faster, so if at some point in time you have questions and you watch this video and you want to post a comment below or something along those lines, I'll be happy to answer it to the best that I can. So there you go.